Hello and welcome to An Extraordinary Life with me, Anne Diamond, here on Viking.TV. Today, let's meet one of the world's leading authorities on China. It's a country of astonishing contrasts, ancient and modern, sacred and secular, enduring and ever-changing, from soaring glass cities to silent tombs beneath the earth. The story goes over thousands and thousands of years, and that story is still being echoed in modern China today. In this episode, I want you to meet Dame Jessica Rawson, who's a scholar, archaeologist, and cultural interpreter who has spent her life listening to what ancient China has to say, not through texts or dusty old documents, but through the objects it left behind. From early bronzes to the terracotta warriors, from forgotten tombs to groundbreaking exhibitions, her work has transformed the way we see China's past and how it still echoes into the present. But let's begin not in a museum or a library, but with a memory and a childhood curiosity that became a calling. Dame Jessica, I would love to start, if you don't mind, at the very beginning, because there is a story of you as a little girl, not terribly happy with letters or writing, but there was something about seeing the Rosetta Stone at the British Museum that turned you on to signs and symbols, and you found that easier to understand.
Yes, I certainly still remember, and I certainly still have the folio on the Rosetta Stone that my parents bought for me that day. The Rosetta Stone in the British Museum is a large chunk of black stone with characters on it, or signs, which translate from hieroglyphics into Greek. And that is how people learned what hieroglyphics stood for and how to understand it and how to decipher Egyptian history through the hieroglyphics. What I really was intrigued was about the signs. I'm what today people would say was dyslexic, probably not very dyslexic, but at school I didn't learn to spell or read very well, and actually I'm a bit obstinate, so I didn't bother. So on the whole, this looked like a godsend. I thought, well, some people write in other ways. And my father happened to be interested in Scandinavia, so there were books on runes at home. They showed me the runes. Those weren't hieroglyphics, of course, and I didn't think they were as pictorial as I would like. So then they bought me a little book on Teach Yourself Chinese, and there were all these characters laid out. What they didn't tell me, and I didn't know then, you have to write your characters in a particular way. You have to write in a stroke order. So you recognise the characters by eye, but you can't write them unless you've memorised them in the hand. So every child in China is learning to read and write in three ways, actually. They're hearing the sounds, which they then have to relate to a written form, which is the Chinese character, and then they have to learn to write it. So for them, that's ear, eye, and hand. We too learn to write, but given people's handwriting, you can see we don't learn very hard to write. There are beautiful handwriting people all over the place in every language, but China demands this very special sequence of how you write a character.
And that appealed to you?
Oh, enormously. I mean, I've been gripped up by it ever since. The characters are very appealing, and when people say, of course, you don't need to have them, you could write it in Latin script, which they might do, it is too ambiguous. There are too many similar sounds which you could write with the same Latin letters, which would not distinguish one word from another. So, of course, the characters are likely to stay, and now they are, if you like, a symbol of China's difference and independence.
And beauty, actually. There's something beautiful about it.
They are beautiful. And their big art, the art that matters most in China, is calligraphy. Far more important than painting, scenery painting.
Yes. But it's interesting that you didn't actually learn to speak Chinese until much later on in your career. Because you became a historian, really. You went to Cambridge and read history.
Yes.
Before really deciding to take up Chinese very, very seriously.
Well, there's more to it than that. My mother introduced me to a lot of things in museums. She saw I had trouble reading, so she got me to use my eyes, and perhaps she trained me in my teens. And then I went to Cambridge and read history, but I actually chose subjects that verged on China with difficulty, and they weren't interested in China. But anyway, it was a very good basis for learning to think. And then I didn't go into research. I took the exam into the civil service. I found myself in the government, in the Department of Health, and it was a bit of a shock, and I wasn't totally suited to it. I'm so obstinate. But anyway, they treated me very well. They taught me how to write English, and actually it helped me a lot in later life, how to follow the Acts of Parliament, make sure you know what is legal, all that stuff. But I was bored. So I went to evening classes to learn Chinese. Uh-huh. And so when I applied for the British Museum, I'd been in the civil service 2 years. They saw that I was trying to learn Chinese, and that helped me. But when I got to the British Museum, they said to me one day, well, you better go and learn Chinese, hadn't you? Mm. And so they said, go and sign up with the School of Oriental African Studies behind the British Museum. And I met Professor Twitchett, and he was very fierce.
Professor Twitchett?
Yes, Professor Twitchett, and he was very fierce and said, you can't come unless you agree to do the whole course properly and take all the exams. But I did do the whole degree, and I'm very, very grateful that Professor Twitchett forced me to.
Because you wouldn't have been able to do all of the in-depth study you've done without a knowledge of the language and how to speak it and how to speak to people in China.
Well, you didn't learn that at the time because it was the Cultural Revolution. So I didn't learn to speak even. I learnt to read, and I also learnt to read and write classical Chinese, and I learnt very complicated character forms. And then Mao Zedong changed the character form to what is called the simplified character form. So there are two forms, but my memory is better imprinted with the earlier type, so I read both. And that's actually something young people in China can't do. They don't understand the background anymore.
No. Which is sad, really, isn't it? Because, well, that's something you do know about.
Yes, but in Taiwan and Hong Kong, you see both. I mean, you see mainly the complicated ones.
When did you first go to China, then? We're talking about the Cultural Revolution, which must have made things very difficult for you to take your knowledge much further. When did you go?
I first went in 75, so that's quite early. And 68, I went to the British Museum to work and did this degree and all that, had a baby, and then they kept on telling me, go to the basement, sort it out. So I kept on going to the basement and sorting it out, and I had to do that more or less by myself. There were people, of course, in the department who knew something about China, but they had been shut out of China since the 50s, and really the knowledge of China and Chinese history and archaeology goes right back to the 30s, when there was a very big exhibition in London in 1935-36, and that was the point at which knowledge stopped. They had learned and enabled themselves to present a fantastic exhibition with cooperation from China. But after that, China, there were wars, then there was difficulties, then there was the Cultural Revolution. And so after that, it was really my generation and people younger than me that turned the wheel and made things different. So I came in at a very good moment because I learned about China as China opened up. So I didn't have to take it all in one gulp.
But when you're a curator in a museum and they say, go to the basement and have a look at what we've got, that must be truly exciting, because we all know now, don't we, that museums have a lot of stuff in their basements.
Yes.
Were you actually able to go down there and just rummage around and see?
Well, not rummage, because that would be dangerous, but yes, of course I could do it, and much more than you could do now. It's much more bureaucratized. But at the time, what they meant was, go and please work out the date, materials and province from which everything comes. So I started with the jades, which one person knew something about and had published some, but jades hadn't been much studied, and therefore actually I got off to a head start doing a subject that was very important in China but hadn't been seriously researched, or properly documented archaeologically until the period I entered into it.
Yes, jade tells a fascinating story, doesn't it? And I know it's something that you're particularly well immersed in, because jade isn't just... Well, jade tells you something about the culture and the trade.
What I think it tells you is that they settled on jade as their top material by chance. You know, these things happen by chance. And jade was first used as ornaments around 7,000 BC,
Oh, my goodness.
Very far north in the Far East, towards the Amur River, which is now the boundary with Russia. And they used it as ornaments, and in that northern eastern area, quite a skilled tradition of carving. You have to do it with a sand, you know, it can't be cut, and anyway, there wasn't any metal at that moment. It has to be ground. And so they developed a large production in the northeast, and it travelled down the sea coast, and ideas about jade then went up the rivers into central China, and it became, I think, slightly mysterious. Some of the most important jades and the most important material was quite early, and then it's buried, and then later people find it, and then it appears miraculous. They regrind it, remake it into something else.
I don't even know where jade comes from.
Well,
where do you find it?
That's a big question. We don't know where they found the first jades. We now know that there's jade over a good many areas in mountains. Everything precious comes out of mountains, like the rare earths today. So you can't do anything in an alluvial plain. So the big mountains in China, and now the mountains on the northern edge of Tibet, are the famous source of later jade. But in these very early periods, there was probably more jade in other places. But we're talking about nephrite primarily, not only nephrite. Both we and the Chinese use a single word for many minerals. But the strongest one in China in the ancient period is nephrite. And then it's very, very difficult to work, and you've had to find it, transport it, break it up, and so on. So it's a big, complicated craft, needing a lot of expertise, and has a very long and continuous history in China, but also only in two other main parts of the world, in Central America and in New Zealand. There are jades in other places and some Pacific islands, but not everywhere. And the other stone which is popular is called jadeite, and that is slightly transparent and more colourful and comes from the sort of Myanmar area. And that wasn't used by the Chinese until after the 18th century, from the 18th century.
Much later. But the very early stuff that you found, the very early jade that you found in the cellars of the British Museum, was used as what? Were they necklaces? Was it used as jewellery?
Not primarily. They're used for two reasons. One, for ritual items, that is, in some way offering to spirits or to communicate with other parts of the universe. I mean, we have a rather limited view of the universe. You know, there's here and there's heaven. But China seems to have a multi-universe where you consult spirits. And we don't know what the early period people thought. So around 3000 BC, there's a huge amount of jade worked near Shanghai. And they bury them in large quantities in tombs. And the primary items are these ritual jades. They're clearly not jewellery. They're huge. They can be a round disc this round, or a tall vertical tube this high. They're not jewellery. There are jewellery items, or items that are symbolic, with beads and then a plaque with incised designs on them. These are not minor things. They only belong to the elite. Our view of precious stones is a bit frivolous by comparison.
Yeah.
And we share a different picture of jewellery. We like gleaming things, which are either gold and silver or cut jewels particularly, or polished jewels. And that's everywhere from India to Ireland is in that area, or the Stans perhaps. But if you cross the Himalayas and you go past Tibet, you're in a different visual world where these jades are very highly valued.
Tell me more, if you don't mind, about the fact that it was when you really immersed yourself in this, in your job, that you realised that everything we look at, all the artefacts and the bronzes and things like that, they all come from tombs. Because of this, I hesitate to use the word worship because I know you don't like it terribly, but the way that the Chinese worship the whole idea of ancestors and family. The tombs weren't just places where they put important people with important things. The tombs were full of what make that man, that person buried there, the person they were, and they wanted to be in the future.
Yes, and I think we must take it a bit more seriously than we do. I think today I would talk more about respecting the ancestors, and I would certainly use a word chosen by one of my colleagues. I would call it an ancestor cult. What I think we should start by saying is, going back to the sedentary culture, the family is vitally important, and they don't move off because they haven't got the sheep to take up the hills or the horses to sell in a market. And I think in many families too, some people seem much more important than others. They keep their lineages written down on tablets, which they then choose as a site of showing respect. And that goes on now today. In the ceremony called the grave sweeping ceremony, which happens in April, people still go to the tombs of their ancestors and other graves in cemeteries and offer flowers and fruit and food to remember and to keep the ancestors conscious that they are being remembered.
And some of those tombs are huge, and contain the most amazing things. I think you told the story of one tomb that had a full dinner service, as though the dead person was prepared for a very big banquet.
Yes, yes. That goes right on, probably down to the Qing dynasty. They are suddenly provided with the utensils for a banquet, which may receive the food or the aromas of banquets that their descendants offer to them. I think we don't know how it works, and I think one thing one should think about, the Chinese don't write about how it works. They don't write down what they think, and very few Westerners are like me. I'm old enough to ask a few questions.
Cheeky questions.
No, I wouldn't ever be cheeky. I think the most important thing to remember with China is, unless you show it respect, you will never get anywhere. But as I'm old, and as I've taught many students, those students would treat me as a relative almost, and might explain a few things if I'm careful in private conversation. Yes. But I don't think I or any Westerner will ever really understand, because they will never get a full account from the past or today.
We've talked about tombs and the fact that so many of these amazing artefacts have come from tombs, and they tell their own story as well, especially if you understand the story. Where were you, and how did you find out about the first discovery of the terracotta warriors? And what was that like, that moment?
Well, for me, that isn't the biggest discovery of all. But so it was, in fact, an introduction to strangeness, because the reaction of the West was to say this is a set of portraits. They had no idea that the belief that this was an actual army and not a portrait of an army. It's a real army, and it's not intended as personal portraits. So the first thing I remember is the few reports showing these figures in among the loess. The loess is this sandy stuff, and they're made of the clay from this loess. But they weren't arranged in rows at that stage. They were still lying in the ground, and they had been found by people digging a well. And I've seen them many, many times, and I've even been in the pit with very important visitors. What it really taught me was one needs to think hard, and that this wasn't a single reaction. A reaction wasn't good enough. What you do is think what it is, and then you realise it's almost a miracle. Miracle that it was made, and miracle that it survived.
Yes.
And this is quite extraordinary. And I think when people go and see it, I don't think they feel the miraculousness of it. I think they see it's wonderful, it's a wonder, they get their photographs taken in front of it, lots of selfies and so on. And it's a huge tourist attraction.
Then for people who are listening to what you're saying now, and who will go and see the terracotta warriors themselves, what should they understand? Can you explain more about the fact that this isn't just a porcelain portrait of an army, this is a living army, to the people who put it there anyway?
It's the army for the afterlife. It's made of clay. It's not as high-fi. It's quite high-fi, but it's not a porcelain. It's a clay army. And we call it terracotta warriors, but actually the importance is it's a whole army with all the different ranks and all the different functions laid out very clearly. Someone knew what an army looked like, and they knew how to make a blueprint, and they knew how to tell teams of workers what to make each day, because the workers were in teams. We know that from inscriptions on the figures. So what is astonishing to me today is the extraordinary bureaucracy behind it and the intelligence to almost draw it. I don't suppose they did draw it, but they made a list of what they needed in each row of soldiers. So what the first emperor and his the people in his administration knew is he needed to be defended from the armies whom he had killed in life. He had won, or his generals had won, battles against 6 other states over quite a long time. And in order to become the unifier, the emperor, a unique and new position, he must have killed thousands, hundreds of thousands of men and their animals and so on. So, and they found some great big tombs full of broken up skeletons. In that case, if you believe in the afterlife as being like life, you expect the armies of the states
of those you killed to come back after you.
To come back after you. So that's the army he needs. And he didn't, of course, want to kill, and I'm not sure he would have known how to kill all his present army, and anyway, then he would have left him vulnerable. So they made what we see as a replica, but they see as real. And maybe that's one of the deeper problems for the West, that we have this idea that an image is a copy of something else, somewhere else, whereas they think the image is the thing. So there's no difference between the image and the thing. And that is a deep belief or understanding that we can't share.
But we need to respect.
Always.
It's absolutely fascinating, and it's been an absolute privilege to talk to you. Thank you so much.